If you're a regular viewer of this channel, you'll know that I have been a trenchant critic of the campaign group Extinction Rebellion, and particularly focusing on the strategy of one of its co-founders, Roger Hallam. I wanted to open this up as a dialogue. As you know, I have a podcast where I speak to successful change makers, so I reached out to Roger Hallam, understanding that it was quite likely that he'd tell me to go sling my hook, and invited him to have a conversation with me, a respectful conversation where we could air some of the key principles that are behind the critique that I have and see where that took us. To his credit, he agreed. Unfortunately, this happened during a time when Extinction Rebellion was right in the middle of moving from one office to another. So we weren't in a venue that allowed for this to be videoed, only to record by audio. So apologies for that, because I'm sure it would have been a better experience as a video if we had done. But I wanted to share here the audio of the full discussion that we had, because I think it was a good discussion and it went into some of the things that you've seen in previous videos. I hope you like it anyway. Here we go. Roger, first of all, thank you for taking part in this discussion. As you know, I've been a consistent critic of Extinction Rebellion and some of the aspects of your strategy for it. So I think it's great that we can sit down and have a constructive conversation like this. Many people would have turned this down, so I really appreciate that you stepped up for this one. And to be clear to the audience, you're taking part in this as an individual, not as a representative of the group. And also to make things clear, the aim of this podcast interview is to explore ideas, and we'll no doubt get into points of disagreement, but this isn't intended to be a debate and the objective isn't to win the argument. So with that clear, generally with these podcast interviews, I start with interviews with successful change makers. I'm always interested in how people get onto this path in the first place. You know, there's some turning point. For some people it comes very early on, for some it comes later on, when whether they did it consciously or not is when they first become a change maker, that they have an ambition to make a difference to the world, not just to be successful in their own terms. So let's track this back with you. Where did this all start for you? What did the world look like to the young Roger Hallam as he sort of left school and looked ahead to adult life?
Well, we didn't know about climate change then, did we? Because I'm 50.
Did it start with that issue? So what were your...
No, I was in the green movement, as you might broadly call it, in my late teens or my mid-teens even. I was in the peace movement in the 1980s. So that's when I sort of cut my teeth politically and ethically and what have you. And I was in the Methodist Church as well. My parents were both strident Northern Liberal Methodists, as you might say. So everything was right or wrong and what have you. That was a sort of introduction, I suppose. Yeah, so I've always been intensely interested in politics and ethical issues.
So where did that take you? I mean, I know you ended up as an organic farmer for something like 25 years?
Yeah, I was involved in helping to set up housing co-ops and workers' co-ops for about 10 years. I think the general idea is if we could create a sort of more sociable society, then that would be good. That seemed quite clear to me anyway. And then I went to the States when I was 25 and I was sort of studying cooperatives and what have you. And then I sort of got the bug on growing vegetables. And by my late 20s, I decided the world was as it was and I was going to retire and grow my veg and have a family and all those adult things that one thinks one's going to do in life. And so I did. I mean, I did become aware of climate change. I think it's the same for millions of people. It's like no one can actually remember when it came into your consciousness. It sort of seeps in. And you can remember when you didn't know anything about it, and you can remember when you definitely did, but you can't remember that moment. But, you know, by the early 2000s, it was there, definitely. And then around 2005, it rained every day for 7 weeks, and I lost £100,000 on my farm, and wow. Everyone lost their jobs. So that was a bit of a wake-up call. Though, to be honest, I was sort of aware that everything was getting a bit amazingly bad before then. And then it rained again the following year for 7 weeks, and then we had the coldest winter ever, and then it had the warmest April and the dullest August. And so it's gone on ever since. So I don't really grow very much anymore. I'm not saying that for sort of political effect. Just the fact of the matter is, you know, I actually can't risk growing outside or growing polytunnels. So, and then 2008 happened, and I thought the world was obviously heading towards some major change with the financial crisis, and I wanted to get back into academia. I was at London School of Economics when I was younger, so I did an MA, and then I ended up at King's College to do a PhD, and I've been doing that off and on for five years now, I think.
Yes.
On the rather unacademic subject of how to cause trouble effectively.
Yes. They probably should offer degrees in that in universities across the country, but they don't. For some
I hasten
reason
to add it's self-funded, just in case any of the listeners are already jumping up in arms that the state should be.
I have very non-judgmental listeners. They would never do such a thing. So, what was the sort of, because you got involved with Rising Up, or you were involved with setting up Rising Up. I'm not entirely sure how that all worked, and you were also involved with your own sort of protests at King's College. So, which came first, and how exactly did this rapid growth in your radicalisation sort of finally take off?
Well, without beating around the bush, my general orientation is that the groups in societies that don't have much power, and if they combine together in an effective way, then they can gain more power and more, pursue their interests, let's put it like that. So obviously that's not necessarily a particularly radical notion. That's what, working people have been doing for 200 years and what have you. So what I was interested in was how people organise and how to become effective. So I had a rather embarrassing list of mechanisms that I sort of wandered around London to various campaign groups, trying to sell them, as it were. And then it got somewhat modified, because if you do a PhD research, usually, if you're doing it well, you usually find out in the middle of it that your original ideas were all rubbish. And the world isn't as you thought it was, because the world has a tendency to sort of put you to rights, particularly if you read too many books. But the upshot of it was I helped set up a rent strike, and I worked with casualised workers in London. And all the time at the back of my mind, I was thinking about the climate change catastrophe situation. And again, like lots of people, it's a bit like, well, I'm sure someone else is going to sort that out.
Yes.
And, it's just like you just don't want to touch it, because you feel like as soon as you do, then you're going to be pulled into some dark world of depression and what have you. And anyway, the upshot of it was I was invited by some climate change activists to talk to them about how they can make their campaigns more effective. So I did a workshop, and a lot of activists, are, like many people, I suppose, quite conservative when it comes to someone suggesting they do things in a different way, sort of human nature, really. But these people were very open, and we ended up doing 3 or 4 sessions. And then I said, in my sort of scholarly opinion, the problem of climate change is systemic. And it seemed like a bit of a no-brainer that the whole of society needs a massive transformation. And that's one of the problems with the whole politicisation of it, is that people think that's some sort of ideological plot or something. But as far as I could see, it was just like obvious. You've got a physics situation and it has to be dealt with. It's a bit like going to the doctor and you're being told you need to completely transform your diet. Well, you just do or you don't, right? It's just a matter of science, really. So I said to them that they needed to look at a whole strategy of transforming society, and that would involve mass participation, civil disobedience. That's a lot of people breaking law all at the same time in a non-violent way. Rising Up was set up with myself and a number of other sort of scholars and activists and general hangers-on, as you might say. And we spent a year or 2 involved in designing this project. And in January last year, I did a paper called Pivoting to the Real Issue, which basically said that climate change is the main structural defect in society, and that's what we need to focus on. And in April, Extinction Rebellion was born, and it was a big collective effort, I hasten to add. And as you know, the rest in history.
Yeah.
So,
were there other potential issues on the table? I mean, you said that you did this paper saying, no, this is the issue. Was there a sort of discussion going on about, well, what is our breakthrough issue? How do we move forwards? And that was what you put on the table.
Well, as you well know, most people that are primarily concerned with climate change are on the left. So amongst that group, there were plenty of people that had a more social justice orientation, as you might say, not in a sort of very dogmatic sense, but in a sense of social inequality is obviously intermixed with this whole situation. So there was some discussions about how that fitted in. But my argument was climate change is going to be the major project that's going to transform society one way or another over the next 10 years. and it's universal. That's my main argument. I don't consider it an argument, I consider it as obvious. I mean, some things are up for debate and some things aren't. And as far as I'm concerned, the climate change catastrophe, yeah, some people are going to die before other people. That's usually the case. But fundamentally, we're looking at something that's going to be enormously upsetting for everyone.
I mean, over the last few decades, I've seen environmental organisations trying to mobilise people around these sorts of issues. And you certainly succeeded to a greater degree than I think we've seen before in terms of getting ordinary people to join up and motivated to not only do something, but many of them to do extraordinary things, like getting arrested and so on. What in your mind is the reason why you've been so successful at that? What was it that made the difference in reaching a whole lot of ordinary people to say, yes, we want to be involved, whereas before they weren't?
The two major starting points on this are a lot of people that are successful, I'm sure you're aware of this, have this rather egotistical idea that they're successful because of great things they do or are, while the literature shows that being successful is actually largely luck. I mean, it's not entirely luck, we don't want to go to one extreme or the other, but there is an irreducible amount of luck in life, a lucky break and what have you. And it would be a bit disingenuous to say, we had this brilliant idea and that's why Extinction Rebellion is enormous. The fact of the matter is, millions of people are shitting themselves about climate change because it's objectively horrendous. Just spend 15 minutes dispassionately looking at the facts and you're going, this is enormous. And if you don't think that, then you really have got some problems with basic analysis. If you're coming from a sociological point of view, there's this no structural determinism, which is there's forces in society, and if people create an opportunity for them, then they'll surge through. So as I see it, the main thing is Extinction Rebellion enabled people to actualise that fear in terms of social protest. But that fear and horror, as it were, had to be there already. If we'd done these methods with getting everyone to wear red hats or something, however amazing we were, no one's going to wear red hats. So that's the first thing to say. Second thing to say is we have used a social scientific methodology. We're not looking at what's gone before and just gone, let's do the same. We've been looking at social science. Now, again, when I say that, I don't mean there's some objective social science out there, but there are some rules of thumb in psychology, for instance, which are broadly correct and which are ignored by a lot of political activists. So what we were doing was looking at the historical record, historical sociology, as it were, looking at psychology and going, okay, so how have people been successful in the past, in the 20th century? Oh, quite a big historical range. And secondly, what's the latest thinking on how you get people to do stuff? So it's a sort of fusion of those two things. And then that translated into 5 or 6 key ideas, which I think enabled us to be successful. Okay, no naming and shaming, right? So we don't indulge or pursue the idea that people are bad because they're doing bad things. That's partially an ethical principle because we're all quite bad, if the truth be known, and all that stuff. But more poignantly, because it's bad psychology. If I say insulting things to you, you're really not very likely to accept my opinions, even if objectively they're right, because we're all emotional beings at the end of the day, and we can talk about this a little bit more. And so that enabled us to build a movement where people coming into the room, they may not have the right opinions, may say the wrong thing, but we're not going to call them out. We're just going to say, well, that's you, and we're going to work together and focus on the positivity. And as some people may know, that's like quite an original idea in politics, because a lot of politics, both on the left and the right, is in the business of being unpleasant to people. So that's one thing. Second thing, you have this notion of post-consensus, which is a little bit technical. But if you're familiar with radical politics, and particularly in the environmental movement, there's this notion that everyone has to be in on all the discussion, particularly in the social movement side of it, which sounds great on paper because obviously, it's good to include people. But in practice, it's a bit of a nightmare because to be a bit caricaturing, spending 5 hours working out where to put the toilets, you see what I mean? So the idea was we adopted a holacratic structure, which is quite well known amongst Silicon Valley firms. And it's a sort of rediscovery of applied anarchism as far as I'm concerned, which is people tend to be more creative and happier when they have autonomy. Now, of course, as everyone knows, autonomy is a bit of a double-edged sword. You don't want everyone going off doing weird things. So in holacracy, it's a bit like you set some basic red lines, being non-violent, being nice to people. We're supposed to be against climate change. and then you train people, and then you allow them to have maximum creativity. From a control freak point of view, it's a little bit scary, but it does actually seem to work, and that's how we've got 100,000 people on butts in 9 months or whatever. So what's the other idea? Non-violence. So that's more or less won the argument. There's very few people in politics now that have the fantasy that killing people is a good idea. It's a deep value in Extinction Rebellion, just like not a rule of thumb. It's like non-violence, respecting people is an essential part of what we're about. And the respecting people, of course, feeds into this idea that if you're expecting people to come on your side, or if you're dealing with the opposition, as you might say, the government, there's no point going in there and doing a big rant. You want to go in there with a respectful, serious demeanour, ask for what you want, and, take it from there. So I'm just thinking about other ones. You can see I don't really have the list in front of me.
No worries.
But, those are a few of... Oh, and of course, civil disobedience. A lot of campaigning has been in this, what we call sort of neoliberal frame of lobbying, emailing, banners, all that shaboodle. And what we've been saying is the fact of the matter is direct action works as a general summary of the literature. And so we're going to go out and break the law in a non-violent way.
I mean, you described your strategy with all of this in the interview that you did some time ago with Chris Hedges. But in that interview on RT, the old Russia Today, with Chris Hedges, you talked about the objectives of Extinction Rebellion and the strategy that you've sort of outlined being to overthrow the political regime, literal revolution, albeit a non-violent one. And the strategies you described to him were pretty much the ones that we saw at the Easter demonstrations, the Easter action for 10 days. Can you explain the dynamics of how that works? I mean, you've talked about non-violent direct action, but you were very specific about how you expected this process to sort of pan out.
Yeah, I can say how non-violence theory works. People have been at it since Gandhi, and arguably before, but systematically since Gandhi and then through to Martin Luther King. And in the last 30 years or so, it's become a little bit more systematised and being subject to more vigorous social scientific study about what the key elements are. There's 2 or 3 sort of key elements on it. Well, one way of looking upon it is there's disruption. So disruption basically gets you attention. It's a fairly amoral principle, obviously. And I'm not going to say whether these things are right or wrong. I'm just explaining how it works. Whether it's right and wrong is another matter. But the fact of the matter is disruption gets attention. And obviously, if it's non-violent, that's what we're talking about, So you can see this in a labour strike or whatever, or when people chain themselves to the front of Parliament with the suffragettes and what have you. That's like the starting point. But the key element that a lot of people don't understand is the sacrifice element. And again, you can call this different words, but I'm just calling a spade a spade. At the end of the day, if you're suffering for the cause, if you get arrested and ultimately if you go to prison, even if people don't agree with you, they're going to go, well, obviously, maybe he is saying something because he's willing to suffer for his beliefs. So that's a fairly universal empathy sort of reaction, as you might say, particularly if it's done in a respectful way, which brings us on to the third element, which is being respectful. Some non-violent literature, it's a bit like, it's very materialistic. You block the city, the economy collapses and the bad guys fall. My research has shown the world isn't materialistic. It's also psychological and emotional. And if you can show, and obviously if you are genuinely empathetic towards the opposition, then one of the key elements is it's easier for them to save face. One of the key dynamics. If you've gone in and said how horrible someone is, then they're a lot less likely, research and negotiation theory around this, that if people basically like you, they're more likely to agree with you, which I know sort of sounds a bit strange to rational minds, but that's what the literature shows. Those are the 3 elements in terms of how to do it. And then how the process goes, again, to be a bit reductive about it, we've got this notion of dilemma action. So dilemma action basically puts the opposition into a situation where whatever they do, they've lost. And how that works is, let's say you're sitting in the street, for the sake of argument. The authorities have got 2 options. They can either leave you there. Obviously, they've lost if they leave you there because you're getting the publicity and you've shown how powerful you are. So that's not great. Or they can arrest you. Or if they want, they can hit you on the head and stuff. Both those options are likely to elicit sympathy by observers and also potentially within the elite, in the opposition, as you might say, where people go, I think we're right, but we shouldn't be treating people like that. And so both sides aren't ideal. This is the difference between traditional left-wing defensive sort of strategies where you want to hold the space, otherwise you've lost. That's not what we were doing in April. A lot of people got into that, of course, because it's quite a natural reaction. But what we were trying to say is, no, people are going to get arrested, so be it. And as you can see, 1,000 people were arrested, and that's probably why you're talking to me now. And lots of people are interested. So then there's a third option, which is negotiation. So the idea, just to be, if you want to have a nice little bar chart, if the let you be and the repression option, both those are enormous costs and they're less than the cost of negotiation, then people opt for negotiation. So it's similar like in a labour strike. At some point the accountant comes in and says to the employee, you're losing more money here by not agreeing to the wage increase. So that's a sort of simplistic model. Yeah.
But from the discussion that you had then and discussions I've heard since, you weren't really expecting the negotiation element of that was most likely. And what you had said in that discussion was that the most likely outcome that was your target was to overthrow the regime, was the collapse of the elites, as it were. Is that still the objective? Because obviously that's one of the areas where my point of disagreement has been, because I don't see that that's ever a legitimate objective for an environmental campaign. This is where we have different perspectives, and that's why it's worth talking about.
Well, I think we have to backtrack a little bit before we get into our first area of disagreement, okay? First of all, I want to say something about predicting the future. People love predicting the future, and it's important to survey the territory of prediction before we get into that realm. As far as I'm concerned, some things can be predicted, some things can be half predicted, and some things just can't at all. But first of all, you have to decide which category it's in. And obviously people tend to go to one extreme or the other, say, oh, it's the future, you can't predict anything, or I've got the law of history sort of stuff. And the fact of the matter is, most of the time, I would argue, as someone that's been influenced by complexity theory, is most stuff in the future is complex, which means you can sort of have an idea, but if anyone comes along and tells you they definitely know what's going to happen, they obviously don't know the system that they're talking about. If you think about what's going to happen to the Conservative Party in 6 months' time, well, we can have a few ideas, but if anyone thinks they know exactly, then they're a bit of an idiot, basically, aren't they? Because it doesn't matter how intelligent you are, you're still going to be floundering around a little bit. When we're talking about the future, we have to, first of all, think about what we're doing. So a lot of what Extinction Rebellion strategizing is about is what we call probing the system, which is a common phrase in complexity theory, which is we go and do things to the system, the whole world, and then you get data back. And that enables you to have a higher probability analysis. So this methodology is very different to what you might call political analysis on both left and the right for the last since the Enlightenment, which is very mechanistic. It's a bit like, we've decided it's this, this and this, and therefore it's going to be like that. At its worst, people don't actually search for data at all. They've read the books and they're just sitting there and off they go. The nice thing about that is it creates a certain humility. One of the reasons I'm sitting here with you now is because I don't actually feel like I have to be right. You may well be right. It may well turn out this is just a really bad idea because we're in a complex system. Yeah, that's one thing. Yeah. So there's another thing we need to talk about before we answer the question, which is what's the nature of the beast?
Right.
And for me, the biggest problem in all this area is people's inability to emotionally and intellectually grasp the severity of the situation that is displayed to us by the science. In other words, if we've got a little bit of a problem, like let's say pollution. Pollution is a big problem, but the solution is reasonably straightforward, which is we need to enact legislation to reduce car use in cities and electrify vehicles. So it's a little bit like the smog in the 1950s in London. It's a big problem, but at the end of the day, it required what you might call a normal political process. People lobbied. The people in powers that be finally decided it wasn't great. There was thousands of people choking to death in London, and they stood up to the various special interests that thought it was fine because they were making money from it. And so if you're in the business of what you might call conventional politics, you're aware of these dynamics, right? Particularly in the centre of politics. There's such a thing as special interests, and that there's such a thing as popular pressure. And sometimes one side of the equation gets a little bit on its high horse, but generally speaking, that's the stuff of normal politics. So I think one of the biggest problems is for a certain amount of time, maybe in the 1990s, you could argue that climate change was what you might call a normal problem. I mean, it was still a big problem. The fact of the matter is, and I'm going to say fact, okay? The fact of the matter is we're in a completely different paradigm of crisis here. I've got 3 reasons for that. First of all, it's a universal problem. It's affecting everyone all around the world. There's only one geophysical system, and what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. You know, this is basic Earth science, isn't it? Right? You know, okay, so the methane gets released. It does take like 6 months to get down to the southern hemisphere or whatever, but that's not very long. It's not just going to affect people in Moscow. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it's existential. It's going to destroy civilization. It's not just David Attenborough said it. It's just every scientist who's got their head screwed on knows that if something isn't done, we're going to lose habitat for human beings. And obviously you can have a bit of a macabre debate about whether the last human being is going to survive or not, but it's a little bit academic. 5 billion people lose their lives through starvation in the tropics in the next half century. That's beyond horrendous, let's put it like that. You know, I usually use this analogy of Holocaust deniers saying maybe Hitler only killed 5.5 million Jews rather than 6. It's a very grotesque way of argumentation because it doesn't matter. So that's what I'd say to the people that want to argue on that one. And the third thing is it's exponential because of the feedback systems. And that's the real terror element of it as far as I can see. Because if it was linear, it would be a bit like, oh, we know exactly where we're going to be in 50 years' time. And obviously you can start predicting it. As soon as you've got exponential element in it, and obviously that is very difficult to predict, then you've got this precautionary principle nightmare. Is it just fine? Or is it actually going to lead to the death of 6 billion people? Well, you need to get that one right, don't you? So this leads to the proposition, all those 3 things combined together lead to the proposition that from a structural sociological point of view, regardless of your politics, there's going to have to be a massive transformation in the economy and society. This is why people who have quite a liberal orientation have now accepted the sort of World War II state intervention necessity model, as you might say. Not because they're like state authoritarians, but because it's just a 101 on political sociology. It's when a state is in crisis, state basically takes control of large parts of the economy.
It's a challenge though, isn't it? Because every authoritarian government in history has justified its early existence because of the crisis of the other, because of the crisis of the thing outside.
Yeah.
Sometimes those crises were real and sometimes they weren't. But as a vehicle to get consent for something that turns into an authoritarian state, that is historically how it is done. So you can understand that people aware of that history would look at the situation and say, well, yes, but ultimately there is a crisis that we have to deal with. I don't go with your description of the science 100%. I don't think it reflects exactly the mainstream science, but I don't want to debate that particularly because the science that is there is bad enough to justify all of the things that say, you know, something urgently needs to be done. Whether it justifies authoritarianism is an open question. For me, the question is always what processes are likely to be effective at getting us out of this hole. Authoritarian societies, because of their top-down nature, because people at the lower areas where they see the consequences of actions are scared to talk about consequences of actions, have never been very environmentally sensitive. As a system of organisation, they have always failed in that regard, and many others as well. You can justify anything by saying the crisis is so bad, something must be done, but it's still worth asking, what are we justifying here? Is it actually a system that is going to work with people the way they are, not the way we'd like them to be, to deliver the solution that we want? Or is it something that feels that it's right because there's a crisis and we do the knee-jerk thing, but it leads us to a darker place? And I'm not sure that I know the answer to that.
No, well, neither am I. I'm a campaign designer. I don't pretend to be an expert in what needs to be done to our society, given that we're now in this existential crisis. There's a few things to be said about this. I think this gets to the heart of the issue of what I think is the tragedy of the right, to be blunt, which is putting your ideology before what you might call the structural situation. An analogy might be you go to the doctor and the doctor says, I've looked at the x-rays, you've got diabetes or whatever, and you've got to transform your diet totally, right? Now, if you don't transform your diet, you're definitely going to die. If you transform it a little bit, then you're probably still going to die. And if you do the whole thing, then you may still die. Now, it's a no-brainer basically to follow the doctor's advice, given those facts. You could get a little bit confused because you could say, oh, my daughter has always been telling me to eat less meat because she's a vegan. In which case you could get confused here by thinking the doctor is the same as your vegan daughter who's giving you a hard time for being unpleasant to animals. And you happen to think it's fair enough to eat animals because humans eat animals, let's say. So there's obviously like a bit of a cognitive error because the doctor doesn't really care about animals. He's not telling you not to eat meat because of ethical reasons. He's just saying you're going to die if you don't. My sort of proposition to right-wing people, as it were, is you making a cognitive error that this isn't your vegan daughter giving you a hard time. It's like the doctor, and the doctor is basically the science. And when the doctor says to you, you're definitely going to die, you're likely to die, arguing about how likely it is takes us back to the 5.5 million or 6 million Jew thing. It's not very clever, let's be blunt, right? The fact of the matter is you've got a crisis and this is a way out of it. Now, the second thing is that lays the groundwork for discussing the situation as it is. What actually should be done? Once you've accepted that, what has to be done is there's a degree of debate about it. I accept that, right? And then you need to differentiate between wanting what you might call a state-led solution. Let's not use authoritarian because it's a little bit of a trigger word. I mean, state-led solutions can be extremely authoritarian or mildly. They're not, that causes a multitude of sins. Let's accept it, right? The welfare state in the 1950s was not Stalinism. People might not agree with it, but you need some nuance of analysis there. So then it's partially an issue of the hard dynamics of how to run a changing economy quickly. And then there's the issue of consent. So the issue of consent, I think, is important because you can have what you might call state-led, authoritarian, inverted commas, states which do have a popular mandate. And this, obviously, the biggest example of this is World War II, where there was obviously an existential threat in the face of Hitler, and people on the right and the left came together, and let's say, for the sake of argument, 80% of the country accepted rationing because they didn't particularly want to live under Nazi rule. And this leads on to the Extinction Rebellion, what I think is a really smart move, dare I say it. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I do think it's a smart move, which is to say, we're not like traditional, progressive, state-down people or leftists or whatever. In the sense, we're not saying to right-wing people or any people, you have to do what we say. We're not saying we've got the answers. We've studied it, done a little Lenin routine and sat in Switzerland for 20 years designing the Soviet economy. We're not doing that. What we're saying is we're going to have this citizens' assembly. And the citizens' assembly structure, and there's lots of academic research to support this, is a highly effective way of bringing people together to rationally deliberate on an issue of national concern. It was done in abortion, as you may know, in Ireland a few months ago. So Extinction Rebellion is like appealing to everyone across the political spectrum, saying, number one, we've got this massive crisis. Number two, we're going to die one way or another, or substantially die if we don't get this sorted. And number three, let's come together as a nation, and obviously as nations around the world, a number of variations on the theme here, to allow ordinary people to deliberate on their future.
At the moment, we have a vision of democracy, which is that people stand and we vote for the ones that we want or least hate, whichever way around you want it to be. And then those people deliberate on our behalf in between. If that system isn't in force, you've had your revolution, and you're now insisting that citizens' assemblies are going to be utilised in the way that you've described. How does that work? Because ultimately, you can't expect 100% guaranteed that a randomly selected group of people from across the country is going to come up with answers that you believe to be in line with the severity of the crisis. Supposing you get your citizens' assembly and they talk to a whole bunch of people and then they say, well, we think what the Conservative government has just signed up to with the net zero impact on carbon by 2050 is the reasonable solution. Do you then throw up your hands and say, oh, well, there you go, we tried, but now that's what the people have said? Or do you say, okay, we need to try again?
This slightly comes back to complexity, doesn't it? Is no, obviously there isn't a guarantee. There's never guarantees in this life. Welcome to life, Having said that, there's two sort of sources of evidence which would seem to almost definitely imply that wouldn't happen. So one is the historical record. There's been 30 years of research on deliberative democracy. A lot of it has been field-based in the sense that you actually do take a bunch of people and you stick them in a room and you expose them to a whole wide range of opinions on a subject, and they deliberate on it and they ask people to come back. There's a way of doing it, which I can describe in a minute. And without going into it in great detail, my understanding about literature, having read quite a lot of it, is quite evangelical, which basically means people come up with amazingly rational solutions to the problems. And it has just as a side issue, they become enormously empowered by it as well. The idea that you stick people in a room and ask them whether they want fascism and they come out and say they do that
wasn't quite what I said, to be fair.
No, but you can see what I'm saying is, I would say it's almost a no-brainer they're going to come out with a very radical solution, because that's what the objective science would seem to imply. The second thing is, since the Magna Carta, we've had a jury system in the UK. Now, as everyone knows, if you look at the research on juries, is often they don't come out with what you might call the right answer. But no one, or at least it's the position of English political theory, as it were, is there's no better way over the long term of deciding whether a fellow citizen is guilty or not than to have a bunch of similar citizens listen to the evidence.
Yeah, but the jury system is about trying to ascertain the facts of the case. They're there to decide did they or didn't they. They're not there to decide and therefore what should be done, because that comes down to the interpretation of the law. No, that's true.
But that's what I mean. I mean, it's not like the end of the story, but I'm just pointing to those two things to point out that for Extinction Rebellion, the research we've done, we think this is like a very creative solution. It's certainly more optimal than us, and who the hell are we, you might say, deciding what should or shouldn't be done. Although it sort of upsets people in positions of power, the fact of the matter is, over the last 30 years, the world's elites, for want of a better word, have been telling the world's population they've got the whole climate thing under control and they'll get it sorted, and they have disagreement and that agreement and that report and this report and all the rest of it. And the irreducible fact of the matter is that carbon emissions have gone up by 60% since 1990. And as we know, they went up 1.6% 2 years ago, 2.7. We're off the scale in terms of abject failure. And that's one of the big starting points of Extinction Rebellion.
The assumption that's implicit in that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so correct me if this is wrong, is that if you have a citizens' assembly deliberating on things and then coming up with the radical solution that is assuming that that's even possible, they do it, you've still got to persuade the rest of the population, because ultimately, if it's radical, then it's probably going to have some imposition on their lives and what they do on a day-to-day basis. For me, the assumption that seems to be implicit is that people would more easily accept that radical solution if it came from a citizen assembly than they would if it came from a parliament. And I'm not at all sure that that's true.
Well, again, without sort of giving you like several hours of evidence, all I can say, and again, this is a social scientific point, do they or don't they? And what's the evidence, right? And obviously, like, the historical evidence is somewhat patchy in so much as it's not like we've got a parallel universe.
No.
This is one of the problems.
Nobody's ever done this on this sort of scale.
No, but that doesn't mean we're completely floundering around. You can do analysis to a certain point, and this is where we need nuance. We can't be saying, well, it doesn't prove anything or it proves everything. Right. My understanding, and I have actually studied this as part of my PhD research, deliberative democracy literature, and people should read it. It's very exciting because it does show, usually with social scientific research, it's a bit like, well, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another, which is what most things are. But with deliberative democracy, it does seem to have very dramatic results in the sense of, as I said, empowering people, and also people coming out with really quite rational solutions. And I know that word is a bit problematic in politics, but leaving that aside, they don't come out with some stupid mad idea just because they're normal people. Just connect with the whole jury sort of tradition. I'll just say what the proposition is that people get persuaded when people like them speak out. So if you've got like a bus driver from Glasgow and he comes into your citizens' assembly and he says, oh, it's, climate change rubbish, I don't really care about that. And then he comes out and says, I've just had a fortnight with the world's expert telling me that this is going to destroy my children's lives unless something dramatic happens. And we've come out with this programme. Then the other bus drivers, and it's slightly simplistic, but the other bus drivers in Glasgow and go, oh, right, that's one of us, and he's saying it. And as I'm sure you're aware, one of the reasons for the dysfunctionality of the political system is the professionalization of politics. You listen to these people, and a lot of normal people are just going, what have they done in their lives? They've driven a bus. So whether that's right or wrong is not a matter. But the point is people, attitude changes, I'm sure you're aware, often happens when people like you say things which you haven't really made up your decision on. and then you go towards that. So if you think of, say, 1,000 people, you're going to have caterers from Basingstoke. You know what I mean? It's going to be, all these people are going to come out. And if you want a case study of this, you can look at this situation in Ireland with abortion, which, as I'm sure you're aware, is a massively divisive issue for, the last 50 years in Ireland. Major arguments, as you might say, on each side. And people went into that assembly, they came out with this outcome that abortion needed to be allowed. The proposition is, and I think the evidence would support it, is once the people in Ireland had heard ordinary people say this, then when it went to the referendum, they surprised the political class with how many people voted to allow abortion to happen. That's not the final word on the matter, but that's basically what we're betting on as Extinction Rebellion.
Okay. We've just seen, as we record this today, it is the day that the government has accepted this net zero carbon by 2050 commitment, which comes from the Committee on Climate Change report that came out a few weeks ago. Arguably, you could say, well, this is a huge step forward. This is more than any other government of a comparative industrial nation has taken up. We're clearly on the way. All we need to do now is implement this. I'm guessing that's not your position.
Well, I take a sort of psychological rather than a political view of the dynamics, the social dynamics of climate debate. What I mean by that is, coming back to the original proposition, is dealing with climate change is a universal issue. So to a certain extent, it's not political, in so much as the definition of political is you've got your interests, I've got mine, and we battle away within some sort of rules of play, right? The universal issue is where it's in your interest and my interest to get something sorted out. So, for instance, research on cancer is not a political issue. It's not like some people going, I don't want cancer to be solved. That's undermining my interest. No, that's fine. Obviously it's got its political edges. Who pays is a political issue. How much by when? But fundamentally, it's universal. My analysis of what's going on with it is it's an addiction problem. It's a social addiction problem, which is we've had 50 years of using fossil fuels, which has had massive material benefits for humankind. There's no two ways of beating around the bush on that one, is there? You can use an argument that we're not actually that much happier anymore, and arguably we're not. But leaving that debate aside, the fact of the matter is, all our civilization, all our society is saturated by the fossil fuel enabling technology. And this is one of the problems, of course. It's like everything around, it's plastic. Everything is in there. It's like it's diffused. And then suddenly we've got this scientific evidence saying this is going to kill us. Now, this is a massive psychological problem because you love all this stuff. You're addicted to it. And then you've got the sort of infrastructural embeddedness of it. You've got to uproot all this infrastructure and change it, which is one of the things people don't discuss very much, of course. I'm sure if you're a civil servant in government or you're an engineer, you're aware of this in a way that normal people aren't. Then you've got a collective action problem, which is no one really wants to get on with it. It's going to be too much pain. So for me, it's a bit like being an alcoholic or something. And I don't mean this in a critical way. I'm not saying people are bad just because I'm using the alcoholic analogy. All I'm saying is, let's say you're an alcoholic, right? There's a point at which you come out of denial and say, first of all, you're saying, I'm not an alcoholic. And then suddenly, one day you say, well, yeah, I've got a drink problem. We're all people like that. And then the next stage is to say, I'm going to do something about it. The saying I'm an alcoholic and I'm going to do something about it have nothing to do with actually doing anything about it. We all know there's people like that. And that's what my analysis of what's happened today. This notion that we're going to sort it out by 2050, that's a little bit of that the alcoholic going, you know what, I've got a drink problem and next week I'm going to start doing something about it. And what we know is we can predict from an alcoholic, using that model, the addiction model, is next week is going to go, you know what, I'm going to do it next week. I don't wish to be cynical about it. This is the analysis that I think is most appropriate. That's not the last word on the matter, but it seems to me anyway that this is why civil disobedience is required. It's a bit like the civil disobedience is basically getting the bottle and saying, you keep saying you're going to sort this out. People have been saying this for 30 years. There's no question about this. We're both old enough to know. Year 2000, they were saying this when they were saying, we're going to have this new program and we're going to reduce carbon emissions. So what civil disobedience does is say, we are going to inflict economic cost. And that's a bit like saying, I'm going to take the bottle of whiskey and take it out of your house. And of course, that's what creates the social conflict.
So, the question for me is, I've studied the technical report from the Committee on Climate Change, and it doesn't propose that we wait for however many years before we get going. It says that by the time we get to 2050, we can get to net zero, but we have to start now because there's various things we can do now and there's certain things that have to be put in place before the next things can be done, which is why it takes as long as it does. The Scottish government can bring it forward by 5 years because they don't have some of the infrastructure challenges that England and Wales have. But there is a plan, and I understand it. I look at it and I say, okay, so we need to decarbonise the electric system, and that involves a certain amount of baseload power, because you can't only have variable wind power that, you know, when the wind isn't blowing, it isn't generating. You have to have a system that will take the variability of that and cope with it. So as a baseload with something like nuclear power, possibly hydrogen with carbon capture, and then a lot more wind, a massive expansion of wind power. And I can understand, because structurally they're explaining this is what function this has within the energy system. This is why we can have this much and no more of wind power, but we compensate by doing this. And we need to start tomorrow. We start building the new wind power infrastructure tomorrow. We start putting in place extra electricity capacity to cope with the new electric cars that are going to be pushed through the system and all of these sorts of things. What I don't get is the alternative. Extinction Rebellion argues that no, we should be doing all that by 2025. And I just don't understand, and nobody understands that I've seen, how that could ever be done except by slamming on brakes in a way that would create massive poverty problems, because these existing systems are there for a reason. Kicking the can down the road isn't something we want to do, but arguing for citizens' assemblies is another way of doing that, ultimately, saying, well, we don't have that solution, but we're sure that these people would come up with it.
On your last point, I think that's not particularly the case, because you can have a citizen assembly in, say, 6 months, and obviously if they come up with a climate emergency agenda, as you might say, then obviously it can be put into force very quickly. I mean, the analogy is that after Pearl Harbor, industrial production was transformed in 3 or 4 months in the USA through state edict, as it were. So, you know, Roosevelt said, as I understand the car industry, you're now producing tanks, not cars. And in 1943, not a single car was produced in the USA. I don't know whether that's absolutely the case, but that's what, and it seems like credible from what I've read and been told. So the fact of the matter is, like, when a society is faced with an existential threat, then it can change very rapidly. Obviously, it's got a certain amount of pain, and there's a big question about who gets what pain, when, where, and how. But this comes back to the problem of how bad is the alcoholism. If your father's an alcoholic and he is, the doctor said he's going to die in 6 months, then it's justifiable to take away the bottle, if you see what I mean. Or arguably it is, you know, there's ethical issues around it. And what Extinction Rebellion is saying is our understanding of the science is that we're on the verge of inevitable social collapse. And that's not like a radical position. It's a position which is rooted in the science. You know, 90% of discussions about climate change, and I hate to sort of return to this issue, is people don't actually talk about what they're talking about. They don't talk about the nitty gritty. It's a bit like talking about cancer. You know, no one's actually asking whether it's terminal or not because everyone's too polite. It's like 1950s sort of thing. What I think we need to understand, and, you know, if listeners aren't aware of this, we need to understand that there's something called locked-in temperature increases. One of the reasons that the Paris Agreement doesn't include this is a sort of charitable reason and not so charitable reason. The charitable reason is because up to recently, we weren't really clear about how big these locked-in processes were. That's a bit irrational not to include them in your analysis just because you're not sure of them. You should still include them in your analysis. The other side of it is the more uncharitable analysis, is this rather unpleasant thing about human beings, which is they're in denial. We have big denial mechanisms. That's how we avoid having to think about death all the time and what have you, is this idea that if we put these in, then we've lost. What people need to be aware of is, in the scientific peer-reviewed literature, there's this thing called the carbon lag. This seems reasonably straightforward. When you put CO2 into the atmosphere, it takes a while for the Earth to heat up. It's not like ding. Depending on which paper you read, it's between 10 and 30 years. The figure that's banded around as an average is 0.7 of a degree. Let's say it's 0.5 for the sake of it. It's not going to be 0.1. There's a degree, unless we've totally got the science wrong. But when people start putting figures into scientific peer-reviewed papers, you know that you're probably in the ballpark. Or at least you have to accept these people spend their whole life studying it. So you can't be too cynical about it. So let's say it's 0.5 for the sake of argument. We're on 1.2 at the moment. We're at 1.7, you know, basic maths. And then we have to add on global dimming. And global dimming, as I'm sure you're aware, because I think you do read the literature, is a big denial routine. It's not really discussed in the literature. It's discussed in the UN October report, but only in a very sort of disparate sort of way. The fact of the matter is, it's in the scientific literature. It's been there since 2005. And depending on who you read, it's like 0.1. It's 1 degree. And if people don't know, this fairly obvious thing that we put loads of pollution up into the atmosphere, and that's like preventing the sun from warming up the earth because you've got this cover. So when you remove that pollution, then more sun is going to come through and it's going to get warmer. So it's not like complicated science. But the question is how much, well, according to the literature, and you can debate it, it's 0.1. Well, that takes us up to 2.7. Even if those are like exaggerated figures, it's like 2.7 before we started. And we've just been discussing in the Paris Agreement that we're going to stop before 2. So, yeah, maybe we're going to get a miracle suck the carbon out. But it's not good. But whether you're right wing or left wing, this is like the doctor saying your lungs are half full and they're going to be totally full in like 5 weeks, but maybe it's going to be 7. And this brings back to my deeper sort of point here, is about emotional acceptance of the facts. Unless we can emotionally go there, in inverted commas, then we can't really start having a rational conversation. And as you may be aware, there's lots of research that connects the emotion and rationality. If you don't have any emotion, you can't really rationalise very effectively. Obviously, too much emotion is another matter. For me, it's a bit like, well, it all depends what we're dealing with. If we're dealing with a situation where we're already locked in to 2 degrees plus, unless there's a miracle technology, we've got 20 years to stop with our carbon budget and we're almost halfway through already, then there's no other word for it. We're in a completely dire crisis. If we can all agree on that, which seems to be reasonably straightforward, potentially we are looking at transforming the economy in 5 years, because the alternative is social collapse, and social collapse is not good.
We're not here to debate the fine details of the science. I do not see a reflection of that imminent social collapse in the mainstream science. I see occasional outlier papers. You see, I think the danger is this, that whenever you become ideological about any of these things, you always pick the things that then support and deepen your particular perspective. And I worry, and we can't solve it here because we'd be pulling out obscure scientific papers and swapping them. That doesn't make for good podcast listening on anyone's scale. But nevertheless, some of the arguments that I hear about the children of today's generation, children may not have a future and there'll be mass starvation in a few years, and these things are not supported by the mainstream science. There may be outlier voices, but they are not.
Well, they don't need to be supported by that.
But no, this is why I don't think we need to.
Principle, right?
But this is why I don't think we need to debate it, because if you take the mainstream science, as I understand it, it is serious enough. It's only because I think one of the reasons why you've been so successful at mobilising people has been the emotional content that you bring to recruiting people around your children may not have a future and those sorts of messages, which I think go beyond where the science goes, but it has a clear connection with people's emotional beings, and it's clearly a motivating call to action. I suppose for me, my biggest worry is that it's a fascinating phenomenon how successful that has been. But if people do sign up to that apocalyptic vision and believe, yes, oh my God, this is 5 years and really it's back to the war time, and they do not see societies moving as fast as they think they should, because societies they know that it's serious, but they don't think it's that serious. The logic of where that goes next is that they say, well, dear old Roger, we know he believes in non-violence, but everyone knows that violence is the superior form of protest. God knows why people think that, but they do consistently. And so a group of them will say, well, it's time for some of us to take this to the next level. And we're going to put on our black balaclavas and slink off and not tell anyone where we're going. And we're going to start really making them take notice, because the sort of things that you can use to justify stopping someone's commute in London by saying, if you think this is bad, just wait till climate change. That argument can go a long way. I mean, you say, well, actually, millions of people will die. So if it's just this plane load of people, that's sad, but ultimately you're not listening to us, so therefore we have to do this. And the logic of what you're describing goes in that direction. Of course, you wouldn't want that to happen. How does one bring people on with the sorts of messages that you're doing on how bad it's going to be without inevitably it taking into that sort of direction?
My understanding of the literature is if a society goes into conflict with its elites, then if a non-violent mechanism is established at an early stage, then that becomes the main socialised form of struggle, and it can maintain itself. Now, it's not the last word on the matter.
It's not what happened in South Africa with
it's not. But there's plenty of examples where it has been largely maintained, unless something really extreme happens. But that's our gambit. But the more substantial issue is that this is a problem when talking to political people. Is one of these things in arguments which is very annoying is you take something that's actually existing and then you compare it with something that hasn't actually happened yet, which is a lot worse. And then you pretend that the thing that's a lot worse that hasn't happened yet is actually real. And, well, you can all play that game. The fact of the matter is at the moment, we are a completely non-violent movement, and we're making that protest on what you might call probability analysis, that if we don't, it's going to get a lot worse. And this is helping the process along. Any probability analysis has a potentially sticky possibility, which is, as you rightly say, people might go, oh, they're blocking commuters, we'll go and start hitting them, right? That's inevitable. There's no form of social action that doesn't have potential unintended consequences. The point is that we've been substantially successful in raising the issue in the UK so far with what we've done. And so arguably we should continue to do it in order to continue raising the issue and getting the nation to start thinking about its responsibilities to its children. That's how we see it. So maybe it will all go to a sticky end. But, you have to make choices, don't you, in real life? And the choice of doing nothing, as the phrase goes, if good men do nothing, then evil flourishes. So you've got that sort of side of the equation to consider as well.
I've commented in the past in some of the videos that I've done that leaderless movements, and most modern campaigning movements are what I would describe as leaderless movements. They're very dynamic, and as you've described to some extent, they try and involve everybody in decision making and so on. And they believe that that's an asset, but generally it's not, because crowds make stupid strategic decisions and they get distracted by the nearest thing in front of them and so on. And I guess one of the things that I saw, originally I assumed that Extinction Rebellion would fail because it would be a leaderless movement. And then I looked into it a bit more deeply and I saw some of the things that you've been saying, and I saw that followed through into what happened in the first half anyway of the 10-day Easter protest. And I redefined my definition as semi-leaderless, which, this is a step up. Because
do better.
Simply because there is no leader as such. We're having this discussion. You're not representing the group because you can't. There is no individual leader. There's no Gandhi. There's no Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela who will make the decisions, who can be good or bad at strategy and the implementation. And it seems to me that it's getting harder, not easier, because you were successful at attracting an influx of people. And most of those people weren't signed up to the strategy, the overthrowing the state, sort of anti-capitalism side of that. They were just concerned about climate change. So it dilutes a lot of that original strategic vision that you had. Doesn't it become harder to then keep that focus and keep that sort of strategy in the future? I mean, we just had this thing about Heathrow and drones and stuff, and I don't know if the Times reported this correctly, but they sort of said that you and people who think the same as you within the group wanted to go ahead with drones on Heathrow, and others now really didn't want to, and there's been all that sort of internal debate. It's a natural thing to happen given what's happened, lots of people coming into the movement. How can you keep focus and not suffer the same fate that those leaderless movements suffer?
Well, again, the first thing to say is, in terms of real world analysis, any large assembly of people is difficult to manage at the best of times. So again, we shouldn't get too idealistic about you stick in a leader and everything will be hunky-dory. But obviously, you're right, there's plenty of support for the idea that if movements have clear leadership, then they tend to be more organised. But that's a little bit of a sort of simplistic starting point. I think there's a lot more sophisticated analysis to be had. You're right, though, that Extinction Rebellion, one of the main sort of innovations was to accept that structurelessness and horizontality, i.e. not having any sort of extra layers of organisation, as you might say, is quite dysfunctional in terms of actually creating mass mobilisation, and certainly in terms of solidity and stability and sustainability, as you might say. So I'm totally in agreement with you on the assumption that you're coming from this and looking at social movements over the last 10, 15 years, which, as I see it, have been mainly social media fueled. And the great problem with social media is that it's great at mobilising, it's terrible organisation. And any successful movement has a combination of the two logics, as you might say. You're not the first person, I'm sure you're aware, to make this observation. And, there has been a certain ideological, don't tell me what to do sort of thing, which has a lot to do with sort of Western individualism as well. It's a right-wing thing as well as a left-wing thing. But the upshot of it is a lot of the thinking that's happened in the States on what you might call organised social movements has been dealing with this for a good 10 or 20 years. And the thinking that's come out of it is this notion of, well, one of the words is momentum organising. And the idea of this is you do have really clear values and really clear aims. And that is essentially an elite project. A few people get together and they decide what the deal is. A bit of a chicken and egg. You can't have 500,000 people in the square to decide what they're going to do until you've got them, and then it goes round in a circle. So it's a sort of inevitable, but it's more like owning. That's basically what happens. 15 people in a cafe a year ago decided the main elements of Extinction Rebellion. And obviously the deal was, if you don't agree with it, then cool, you can go and do something else. It's not like anyone's forcing anyone. So the next step is to train people in those so that people are clear about whether they agree or not. We're not violent, we treat people with respect, we put our hands up in meetings if we want to speak, down to some nitty-gritty sort of stuff. And then the next element of it is to give those groups a lot of autonomy. And the reason, as I said earlier, was because this enables a movement to grow quickly, but still maintain some coherence. So arguably you're getting the best of both worlds. Well, you're not getting the total best of both worlds because no such thing, but you're getting a quite good bit of both worlds. And there's organisations in the States like the anti-migrants movement, for instance, was based upon these principles. So then you can see a movement that lasts for 5 to 10 years, let's say, for the sake of argument, rather than something like Tahrir Square, where you've got this massive social media fueled mobilisation. And then it all collapses afterwards. There's no surprises. Well, no one was thinking about it. Well, I think one of the reasons for the success of Extinction Rebellion, if I can blow our own trumpet a little bit, is we actually thought about it. We designed it for a year and a half before we went and did it. So a lot of the problems which come up have been quite overwhelming, to be honest. It is quite scary to have 100,000 people going, what now? So, but it obviously we do have processes, and as you've seen with the whole drain debate, some of these are quite heated. Welcome to politics. People have different ways of bringing things about, but we've resolved that and we've decided to come to a solution on it, and that's through deliberative process of different working groups. The jury's out on whether having a figurehead is a good idea or not, as far as I can see. There's pros and cons. But I certainly agree with you, and it's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned, that you have to have structured organisation. Otherwise, you're just in a big mess.
What happens next? I mean, there will be things that you're keeping under your hat about what's next and so on, but in principle...
Well, not really.
Okay, well, that's excellent. So
this is one of the things which I forgot to mention at the beginning, is it's an open movement. And this is quite an innovative thing, because on the left and the right, there's this notion that we're going to keep our ideas secret, Well,
yeah, but you've already had a leak of internal discussion about
obviously there's internal discussion. And, well, that's the point, isn't it? Is send an email out to 20,000 people, then obviously it's in the public sphere, because half of those are, some of those are journalists. So this is the whole point about openness, is if you're actually going to be successful, you're going to necessarily have to be open. Because in the social media world, there's no such thing as secrecy anyway, unless you're going to be a little sect in a North London pub, sort of designing a rebellion for 20 years. So you might as well go with the flow and say, we're openly debating this, and I go and see the police. I tell them the truth. I tell them we're not playing around. We say, we're going to block these roads, and if you want to arrest us, so be it. And so I talk to some of the police officers, and they're saying, there's no point raiding Extinction Rebellion. What are they going to find? They're just going to find what they know anyway. So that old sort of confrontational, secretive, revolutionary politic model, now that's all gone. And also it enables loads more people to get involved because they sort of know what's going on.
Yeah, and this is very much for Gandhian roots that you were talking about before.
Yeah, it's an ethical principle as well, but it makes complete logical sense in a social media age as well.
Okay, so Roger, what's next?
So what's next? So being open with you, I don't know.
I didn't know that was where we were going with all of that.
The leaderless movement, you see.
Yeah.
No one really knows. But I will say one or two things, which is, as we see it, again, without blowing our trumpet too much, we've obviously had a major success. We were just given these stats the other day that concern with the environment has gone from something like 12 to 25% in terms of the top 3 issues. It's hardly revolutionary, but for a bunch of disorganised hippies, as it were, that's quite an achievement. Not that we are disorganised hippies.
Semi-organised.
Diverse movement, all the rest of it, blah, blah, blah. But, so the next step is around the world. Obviously, it has to be a global thing.
Yes.
We're making connections with other movements, other networks, trade unions, animal rights people, environmentalists, in so much Extinction Rebellion is a little bit separate from that. And we're all going to descend on London provisionally around the 7th of October. And we're going to do something similar. And what we want next time is for the government, again, this hasn't been formally agreed, but I think it's a reasonable assumption that we're going to be asking for the government to actually get on with it and not make nice fancy statements, not just have a meeting with Gove, not just have Jeremy Corbyn go, yeah, there's a climate emergency. We actually want the enactment of policy. And again, we can have arguments over what that should be, but that's the direction of travel.
Okay. One of the things I find quite puzzling on all of this, because as you know, I have this background with corporate responsibility and worked with a lot of people in some of the leading businesses in the UK who have been working on this issue for quite a long time. People like Marks and Spencer and Unilever, who made net zero commitments before any government had, and have been working towards them and making progress towards them over the last 10, 15 years at least. And a lot of the solutions that we need come from some of the sort of dynamic approaches that they take to innovation and all of those sorts of things. But then there was a very early flutter of an innovation around an XR business interface, which seemed to be almost immediately shut down. I saw some kickback from some of the people who were very into the anti-capitalist heart of the founding group, who weren't at all happy about any sort of flirting with business. But it seemed to me there were so many people who have been trying to implement this and to get large companies to take this on, and have had some quite open doors that they've been pushing on, some more than others for sure. That engaging with that willing group of potential supporters, they wouldn't necessarily have gone with the overthrowing the state part, but that hasn't been a particularly part of the public profile. I couldn't understand why that had been slammed shut. I don't really know any of the background to it other than what we've seen in public. Why not form those sorts of alliances as well?
I'll try and be observational about it.
Yeah.
There's several different things going on here. The underlying feeling around it is a certain sort of tragedy as I see it. But obviously, a lot of people that are involved in Extinction Rebellion come from left-wing backgrounds, not exclusively. And for them, first of all, there's a moral element to it, which is corporate capitalism has basically driven this process knowingly for the last 10 or 20 years. And so it has a moral responsibility to acknowledge that. And of course, a lot of what the corporate sector has done is to try and do this greenwashing thing of sort of appropriating great ideas or positions and then diluting them so that they don't undermine their fundamental economic interests, or short-term interests anyway. So there's that suspicion. And I think emotionally that was what powered a lot of the reaction. But there's a more sort of pragmatic element to it, which is that we have now, and I think it is Extinction Rebellion's position in terms of coming out of the extremity of the crisis, we've moved away from what you might call a market-driven solution to the climate crisis. Now, that doesn't mean we're all going off and becoming Stalinists, right? What it means is that when a society and a state are in crisis, then, as I said, it comes back to our original point. Historically, is the state tends to take control and creates legislation that will transform the economy rapidly, as you saw, in World War II and what have you. Now, you can ideologicalise this, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, because I think a lot of your audience, I hope, grappling with this dilemma. And it is a genuine dilemma, so I'm not trying to be unpleasant or anything, but it's a bit like, if you're a market-based guy, and I accept that there's plenty of research and literature and empirical evidence that market-based solutions do create lack of corruption, efficient solutions, libertarian society. There's no two ways about it. These things are pluses. There's minuses as well. But what I'm trying to communicate, and what I want to communicate in this podcast really, is there's a bit of a double bind situation here, which is Okay, so you're saying there's a market-based solution, but let's say there isn't. Okay. And at a certain point, you have to accept sociologically there is a point where the state has to intervene. Everyone accepts that, apart from an extreme libertarian, that the state has to do the law and order process. The state has to declare war. This is traditional classical liberal position, which is there's certain things the state does best and there's certain things that doesn't, right? And everyone argues about the in-between bit. But the point is the longer you leave it, the more you're going to have what you want the least. So say, coming back with the cancer, you've got the lump in your body. You think it's no big shakes. You think you can deal with it by having herbal tea or something. And then one day you accept that you're going to have surgery. Now, the longer you leave it, the more likely you're going to have the surgery, right? This isn't a sort of ideological thing. This isn't some sort of, hey, socialists are going to win the day afterwards. This is all a bit like, that's childish. If we're going to have an adult debate about it, we need to accept this. Everything basically rotates around this precautionary principle, doesn't it? Which is, maybe we do need to have something quite state-based sooner rather than later to avoid a complete nightmare in 5 years' time. Obviously, we can argue about that, but if we understand the structure of the dilemma, then maybe we can work together a little bit more. And coming back to the corporate responsibility thing, yeah, I mean, that's great. But at a certain point, everyone knows it has to be structural change, and there's plenty of support for the idea that the state is best at creating structural change.
I think there's a distinction between what roles are best played by which sector. I mean, the state doesn't want to be distributing food to people. The state doesn't want to be distributing all sorts of things that it's generally not got a track record of doing more effectively. Where we have seen governments driving change through market mechanisms has been when they've given deadlines. So when we had the issues with chlorofluorocarbons giving us the hole in the ozone layer, and what governments did at that point with the Montreal Protocol was to say, in 5 years' time, we're going to ban this chemical. You've got that long to come up with an alternative because it serves a genuine purpose that has all sorts of benefits. We recognise the benefits, but we have to get rid of this one. So you're on the clock, mate. You've got 5 years. Get on with it. And they did. And in the same way now, the government has just signed up to these principles where it says we are moving to an electric vehicle infrastructure. That means that they're going to be banned outright by this day. That means all new cars are going to have to be electric by this day. That gives us time to build the additional electric provision infrastructure that will service all those vehicles, which we need to do before it's feasible. But you're on the clock. So you've got to get on with it, and you've got some obstacles to overcome because there's all these materials that have to go into these, and you've got to find the right ways of getting them and so on and so on.
Yeah.
So I understand how states can drive change that way by giving businesses challenges that innovate or die effectively, a relatively short timeline to do it, to focus things. And that has been quite successful in creating innovative solutions that have solved our problems. I don't get a sense that ignoring businesses and saying, oh, well, governments do it all is a better way through, because governments are generally bad at innovation, and surely we do need innovation. It's got to be part of a solution. Even if you say, oh, well, you can't have just business as usual with a bit of technical fixes thrown in. I understand that position. But the alternative extreme is equally unbalanced, I would say. So engagement with businesses to at least see the best and some of the ideas that they have.
Yeah, I mean, engagement covers a multitude of sins, right? So let's talk specifically, right? I'm more than happy, and I'm sure Extinction Rebellion, I'm more than happy to sit down with business people, like we're happy to sit down with right-wing people. We're happy to sit down with anyone, as far as I'm concerned, without going to the obvious extremes of Nazis or something, but to say, guys, there's a problem, right? And to discuss we have the standard talk. We're going into some of the national newspapers to do this talk at the moment and saying, like, we've got this problem. And civil disobedience is a way of speeding up. And that's what we're about. And we can go into businesses and say, our understanding is the UN has given us 10 years to reduce carbon emissions by 50%, right? As it happens, we think that's scientifically illiterate because of the feedback mechanism. So we've only got 5. But it doesn't really matter. We can have big disagreement. 5 or 10 years, in a wider scheme of things, that constitutes an emergency by any definition. So there's lots of things that businesses could do. But the broad point here, as you've just accepted, is that the state intervention basically creates a level playing field. That's the first thing. And as I'm sure you're familiar with the classical liberal political theory, which is the biggest problem with collective action is collective action problem, which is a business doesn't want to do the right thing because other businesses aren't. And what the state does is says this has to happen to everyone at the same time. So then everyone's competing on a level playing field. Do you see what I mean? There's downsides to it. I'm not saying there's downsides to state intervention, but that's definite plus side. And then there's the social equity problem. So this is going to become more and more of an issue, which is if you use regressive taxes in order to create a greener society, then you're penalising the poor. And we've just seen this with the uprising in France. If you say to people, okay, we don't want diesel vehicles anymore, we're going to increase the price of diesel, then poor rural people are paying 23% extra for their diesel, which if you live in a rural area like me, basically means you're going for rebellion, right? So what does that mean? So the option is a socialistic solution, right? And I'm talking technocratically here. What they did in World War II is rationing. So the rationing thing, which obviously is a bit of a taboo on the right, is to say, right, everyone gets a certain amount of petrol or diesel. No one wants to go down that route. I'm sure people on the left don't want to, it's not very pleasant. But again, this is the gambit the right is playing, is the longer that you don't actually do the right thing or allow the state to have a soft landing, the more likely you're going to have a hard landing. And this is the debate that needs to be had. That's my challenge. And I'm interested. I'm genuinely interested. It's not like I'm trying to... We've got an objective problem, haven't we?
The challenge is, what are the mechanisms for addressing it that work? And for me, the drawback is always that people are very good at focusing on the climate science end of this and saying, well, this must be done, and totally ignoring the human science of it, the psychological, the organizational science of it, which says, well, how do human societies create change that sticks? How do you do this in a way that people will accept? Because if you try to do it and you get a rebellion all of your own, then you're not going to get anywhere. Traditional environmentalists have advertised that their solutions by choice always involve people giving stuff up, have done for 30 years. Always, oh, you should be driving less. Always, oh, we should be eating less of this, and so on and so on. Yeah. And this has become all pervasive now. I was listening to the interview this morning with Caroline Lucas and John Humphreys, and Humphreys going straight into this, oh, but doesn't this mean that people will have to give up their holiday in Spain and this and this? And you think, how do you get this from the Climate Change Committee's report? I mean, it's not even in there. It's so embedded as a reaction to the environmental argument because it's been reinforced time after time. Now, if you have people who are committed to you having as good a life as possible and are on your side in making your life better, and then one day they turn to you and they say, we have tried to make this work, you know that we want you to have as good a life as possible, but in this situation we now have to do this, you're much more likely to accept it in that situation than you are when somebody comes along and says, well, you know me, for 30 years I've been telling you that you should give this up and give this up and give this up, and now I'm going to make you give it up. Because the one has earned trust that they want the same thing as you, and the other one has always seemed a bit strange and a bit austere and in their own particular perspective. When Extinction Rebellion has done its actions, and I first criticised it because I felt that it would be polarising, whereas what I thought we needed was to build consensus. The challenge is that people look at you collectively and they still see, oh yes, those are the people who want us to give this up and give this up and give this up. And it's the same way that generals are often the best peacemakers because they have nothing to prove. That's been shown in a number of contexts. Whereas those who are always the doves, when they take power, they always have to try and persuade the other side they're not going to be too extreme. In many ways, I think it's easier for a right-wing government like the Conservatives in the UK to be radical in this area than it is for a group of people who have always been known as being those people who want to make us give stuff up.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where the right comes in. This is my challenge to the right. I'm well aware of that. I mean, Disraeli, 1867, giving the vote to the working class. The Conservative Party has been quite smart, not so smart at the moment, but in terms of basically jumping on something that they know has to happen. And I am waiting for the right to get with the programme. When are people on the right going to realise this isn't some left-wing conspiracy? It's an objective, natural disaster, as you might say. I mean, it's obviously created by human action. The point of the matter is it's not a social construction. It's not socialism. I mean, socialism has got its pros and cons, but it's the weather. The weather is going to get more and more extreme. We're not going to be able to grow food. When you can't grow food, you can't feed people, and then people starve. That's not a complicated, logical process. I'm not quite sure how this is going to happen, but when it does, then hopefully we're going to see some major transformation. And if we don't, then obviously we're going to have civil wars and things. That's what I predict, because people are just going to be like this and people need to come together. And that's what Extinction Rebellion is. One of its messages is we're going to have to all sort this out together, or we're all going to be butchering each other at some point. And there's plenty of historical examples of that. How do you persuade people? Yeah, that's really good. So the environmental movement has made like really bad mistakes. The most fundamental mistake is to call it the environmental movement for a start, because as soon as you've said that, you're creating a framing, which means there's the environment there and then there's me here, which is like scientifically illiterate. Are your kids the environment or not? Well, they're not you, but presumably you care about them a little bit. Do you care about your food that's being grown for you? Is that the environment? Well, this is a ridiculous dichotomy. I mean, obviously it's functional to a certain extent, obviously it's me and then there's the world outside. But in terms of looking at what my self-interest is, it's totally illiterate to say the environment is separate from me. So as soon as you've set that dichotomy up, then people on the Today programme can sort of create this, you're taking away my rights. No, we want to have a policy that's going to enable our children to not starve, right? That seems like pretty self-interested to me. That's the first thing to say, is like, it's entirely in our self-interest to actually look out and do what's necessary for our children not to starve to death. Or if you want to use the precautionary principle, to remove a low possibility, right? As a famous scientist has said, do you want to put your kids on a plane that's got a 5% chance of crashing? No, you don't, right? It's a no-brainer. So let's not get into the 5.5 million, 6 million thing that we talked about before. That's one element of it. The other element of it, and this is another thing that the environmental movement and people on the left and the right generally don't get, is people change through emotion. They change through getting upset and becoming emotionally animated. And we know this from our personal lives. If you've got a bad habit and your wife or whatever says to you, really don't do that, and you just ignore it, right? But then if she comes along and screams at you sort of thing, it's not very pleasant. It probably isn't a great thing to do, but there's a good chance you're actually going to change your behaviour. What civil disobedience does is basically create emotionality in society. It's not some guy just sitting in front of a telly going, you know what, we need to do something about the climate crisis. It's more like this guy's like getting dragged into a police van, right? And what that does, rightly or wrongly, I'm just saying, is people go, hang on a minute, there's something going on here. And one of the things which social scientists have said, which is a nightmare point, which is human beings are not very good at dealing with crises until they happen. The horror of climate change is when it's actually happening, when 2 million people have died from heat stroke in Pakistan in 2 years' time, it's too late. This is why the analogy with cancer is so strong. You've got the lump and you're just denying it. So what civil disobedience does is creates the shitty situation now. And although it's a bit irrational, like rational people might go, oh, well, sitting down the street, what's that got to do with climate change? That doesn't matter, because people are still thinking about it. We closed down London. No one's pretending that wasn't unpleasant for a lot of people. But the fact of the matter is now 65% of the British population accept there's a climate emergency. So you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to be like knocking people on the head. And this is the beauty and genius of civil disobedience. Is it's this sweet spot between just cognitive change, which doesn't work when, as we've established, there's major structural change to be happening. Cognitive change is great when we're talking about 4 + 4 = 8. You will accept that, right? But when you've got to fundamentally change your interests and your lifestyle, you're not going to be changing unless you get emotional. That's just the way it is. You can see that's the logic.
We have to halt at that point. We've covered a lot of territory there. Roger, thank you very much indeed for this discussion. I think it's been a useful and interesting
got an idea.
Exchange of views.
Can I share my idea?
Please do.
I can ask you a question.
Go on.
Okay, so I'm quite a sort of like innovative guy, even probably confuses people because people probably think that I'm some sort of nasty lefty or something. But I have actually been innovated in businesses most of my life. And I have, as hopefully shown by this interview, quite an open attitude. I'm interested in people that disagree with me and what have you, because I'm interested in getting lots of information and data. One of the reasons I wanted to do this interview was, and I hope I'm not sort of like hijacking it because it's your call. I watched your 2 podcasts about a guy called Jordan Peterson and some other right-wing guy in the States. And like with lots of people, without getting a big debate about Jordan Peterson, there's a lot that he has been saying, which is quite interesting, philosophically, religiously, psychologically. And it'd be churlish to say otherwise.
Yes.
Which isn't to say, by the way, just on record, that it's not like I agree with lots of things he says.
There'll be people on Twitter.
There is such a thing as agreeing and not agreeing at the same time on different points of view, blah, blah, blah. But what I'm interested in so much as you're on the fringe of that world as I see it, I mean, I get that you're quite a centrist, but you're part of that rational, intellectual, semi-right-wing sort of world, but maybe not. I think it would be useful to draw some of those people in to have some debates about where we're going with the climate. Because as you rightly said, this is what I'm saying as well, and it struck a chord to me. It's like, okay, so you've got all these opinions, and then you seem to be completely contradicting yourself when it comes to the climate situation. And, if we're going to avoid civil wars, as I would predict, we need rational people on the right to actually starting not using silly arguments. I mean, there's plenty of people, I accept there's plenty of people on the left that use silly arguments, but there's plenty of people on the right do as well.
Shall I tell you what I think is happening there? From where I sit, those people, the Jordan Petersons, the Ben Shapiros, they are very, very good in their own areas where they're most interested. Whether you agree with them or not, they put a lot of focus in, they go to original sources, they know their stuff, and they can argue in great detail, and they've thought about it. They come up with very well-crafted arguments. Most other areas, they get their opinions the same way that most of us get our opinions, which is that we absorb them from our peer group. The literature tends to suggest that although we believe that we've looked at all the facts and come to rational conclusions, by and large we believe what our peer group believes, or however we've defined that.
Yeah.
And my feeling is that in the areas where they have the most interest, they have broken through that because they're looking at original sources and they're thinking deeply about it. But this is not one of those areas. So they've tended to just absorb the basic overtures of their peer group, which is sceptical, because they're both from North America and obviously the divide is much bigger there. And I suppose my point of doing those videos was an aim to try to start challenging that group that idolizes heterodox thinking, challenging old ideas and so on, to say, come on, you're being lazy in this area, adopt those principles to this area, because we need you to be winning over particularly the American right to stop arguing about whether this phenomenon exists. They can debate with the liberals about whether the Green New Deal is the right way to do it. They can argue about the details of implementation. But let's get them all lined up in terms of principle of, yes, this is something that we have to do. And so that was kind of the motivation for doing that. And I think that there's some ability to do it. But again, you're thinking about, well, how do you persuade people? Those are intellectual, influential thinkers.
Well, if one of the people that's listening to this has a line to these guys, then we could set up a little debate. Because, I mean, I'm not totally bought on the idea of debate produces the right outcomes every time. I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. But I'm certainly quite original as someone on the left that actually believes that open debate is actually a radical principle and does produce change as long as people are open to that debate. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of point debating with rabid people that don't even want to accept climate change is happening, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
But I think with people that pride themselves on empirical analysis, then we're all in the same ballpark.
Well, in many ways, this is the model of discussion, I think, that could usefully happen, whether it's got an audience in front of it or not. I think the classic debate things where you're trying to win over the other side probably isn't the model.
I think what people on the left need to do is to offer and challenge the people on the right to come and openly debate this crisis.
Yes.
And no one's going to pretend we're all going to agree, but that's not the point. The point is it creates some understanding. And understanding is a very underestimated phenomenon.
No, I absolutely agree. And you were right. You call me a centrist. I mean, whenever I do these little things about how should you vote in the coming election, I always end up right on the line. I did one the other day just to double check every now and then. You see which way you're drifting and so on. And we had left and right, and we had libertarian and authoritarian. And I was smack in the middle of left and right, very slightly drifting into the libertarian end. That fits with my self-image. And from my point of view, the sort of commentary that I put onto the YouTube channel has been very specifically about challenges to left and right. challenges to the right to say, come on, sharpen up, because you could be putting forward some of the most valuable ideas here. And to the left, actually, because you're not getting real opposition in this area, some of your ideas are flabby and self-indulgent, and you should be challenged as well. The joy of challenging is that even when you're wrong, you still benefit people by having to defend their own ideas. If you're sitting in your own echo chamber and everybody agrees and nobody ever challenges your ideas, you can be sure that you will gradually go further and further into something that's not realistic.
Yeah, and we're not saying anything original here. I mean, a lot of social commentators have made this point, is we're moving into a society where people are in ever greater silos. It's no brainer this is bad for the stability of society and what have you. So I think there's a moral obligation on people that want open debate to actually join together and engage in it. And I think one of the reasons why Extinction Rebellion has been successful is the fact of the matter is Extinction Rebellion was started by a number of heretics on the left. As I'm sure you're aware, I've been criticised a lot by people on the radical left, and no doubt these criticisms are sometimes correct. I'm not saying I'm perfect or anything. The point is we've innovated. And innovation is always painful and often wrong. But the point is that's what you need in societies in order for them to stay healthy. I mean, there's no question about that, I think. The next step, I think, is I put this invite out to people on the right, so long as we're not going to get into a slangy match, let's have this debate. What's happening with the climate crisis? What is the science? What are the options? And let's investigate this bind that we're in. Which is the longer that we delay thinking it's business as usual, the more likely we're going to have what just about everyone doesn't want. No one wants the government wandering around telling you you can only have like a certain amount of sugar a week or something. Even if you think it's not a good idea to have sugar, certainly just about everyone agrees that's not the ideal state of affairs. Yes. But that's what's coming down the road as a real possibility. Okay, we can argue about how probable it is, but no one can debate that that's going to be coming down the road if this isn't sorted out. So it's in everyone's interest to actually find some sort of common ground that the whole thing needs to get speeded along.
Okay, well, we'll let that challenge hang in the air. See how we do in terms of responses to that. Roger, thank you again. It's been a great discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much.
A real pleasure.
Yeah.